I see a lot of familiar names. Thank you all for joining. I'm really excited to kick off session number 2, and I will be talking about my capstone project to understand and advance climate change as a political issue in the 2020 elections as a means of pushing forward climate policy. So my big question coming into the CSP program with a professional background in climate policy was, how is it that after over 30 years of significant public attention, we're still struggling to address climate change, particularly at the national and state policy levels? At this point, we have the specific knowledge, the dedicated organizations, and the tools and technologies that we need to solve the problem. And we have the financial resources and have had quite a bit of time. The answer I come to is that the primary barrier to scaled up climate action, that is action commensurate with the problem, is an issue of politics and political will. Now, from media coverage and personal experience, perhaps, we're familiar with the surge in climate activism over the last half decade or so. And if you look at public polling, it's clear that this isn't just a small dedicated group of activists, but is actually sentiment captured broadly across the US electorate. We've seen a rapid growth in public support for both environmental policy and climate policy in particular over the last 5 years. And this is especially true since the climate youth movement kicked off in 2018. However, as these graphs show, this increased concern is highly partisan, and the increasing polarization of climate change over the last decade and a half is well documented. This makes climate an interesting and potentially very important issue going into the 2020 elections. Some other aspects to it, some polls show that climate and the environment have the fastest policy interest growth of any issues before COVID, but they start from a particularly low point. Second, this interest continues through the election, even with COVID and the resulting economic downturn. Third, climate is especially supported by key voter demographics for the Democrats. I would say voter and donor demographics. That includes young adults, people of color, especially Latinx folks, and women. On the right here, we can see environment and climate have the fastest growth over 1, 4, and in the case of environment, 8 years. With this in mind, I developed my capstone project to focus on climate change as a political issue in down-ballot electoral campaigns in 2020. First, I supported campaigns directly by serving as Climate Cabinet's first head of impact, and then I investigated candidate communications through academic climate messaging research. Why focus on elections as a means of moving climate policy forward? First, we know that the issues candidates focus on most during campaigning are the issues that are most likely to get legislated on. The second is a hypothesis that candidates will be more responsive during the campaign season when essentially their jobs are on the line than through conventional legislative session lobbying techniques. Why focus on down-ballot candidates? For those who aren't aware, down-ballot candidates are not president, US Senate, but lower positions of government. I focused on the US House and state senates and state houses in particular. The first reason to focus on these candidates is that they receive less attention, public attention, fundraising attention, attention in the media, and in academia as well. However, the policies that they legislate are critical for the climate. States, for example, control a lot around utility regulation and what percentage of electricity needs to come from renewable sources. For my project, I partnered with a wonderful group of folks at Climate Cabinet. And Climate Cabinet is an outfit that focuses on tech-enabled electoral support to these down-ballot candidates on climate and clean energy issues in particular. In 2020, their election cycle activities fell into 2 main areas, and it's their down-ballot focus combined with these 2 areas together that make Climate Cabinet a fairly unique organization. The first area is engaging candidates on climate. So climate is a relatively difficult issue to message about because the particulars depend on the characteristics of the district. So Climate Cabinet helps candidates to effectively message about climate locally for their district, and they conduct this at scale to reach many down-ballot candidates at once. Second, Climate Cabinet conducts campaign fundraising, targeting climate donors to fundraise for critical climate races, particularly in state legislatures. One example candidate that Climate Cabinet supported is Ann Johnson. She ran for Texas State House in a Houston area district. She ran as an unapologetic climate champion against a denier incumbent. She received support from Climate Cabinet as well as many other orgs on climate messaging and fundraising. She ultimately won her election and became a founding member of a new climate caucus in the Texas State House, already working to push forward climate-related policy in a notoriously difficult state. My role at Climate Cabinet as head of impact was really to leverage data to provide answers, particularly about the effectiveness of Climate Cabinet's different campaigns. And this meant tracking both candidate and donor behavior. In the process, I observed several things about candidates with respect to climate. One is a very large variation in how candidates messaged about climate change. And the second is that they were responsive. They were willing to adapt the way that they messaged on climate after our interventions. So this sparked my research interest in, one, why candidates choose to message about climate or not, and two, how candidates message differently and which types of candidates message in which ways. This leads me to my ongoing research project into candidate climate messaging. I'm looking at 1,200 down-ballot candidates focused on general election Democrats in the US House and competitive state legislatures in particular, using their campaign Twitter accounts as a data source. And from these accounts, over a long election cycle, I scraped a corpus of nearly 1 million different tweets. Then I apply computer-assisted content analysis to categorize these tweets into particular issues, climate change or healthcare, and particular frames within climate change. In the background here, we have a word cloud generated from the extensive literature review I conducted with topics that come up most frequently in the review largest here. My research asks questions in 3 main areas. The first is salience, the salience of climate change, meaning how important climate was compared to other issues in the election, which has impacts for the way and the likelihood that climate is legislated about. The second area is the determinants of climate messaging. What drives a candidate to message or not to message about climate change? What drives them to message more or less? And the third area is framing. Simply put, how do candidates actually message about climate change? I focused particularly on Democratic candidates, and there are theoretical reasons for this around concepts of party issue ownership. And this bears out in the data where we see that Democrats message much more often about climate change. And more importantly, they message very differently than Republican candidates do. And so as an illustrative example, I took tweets that were tagged through a keyword-based approach as climate-related for both Democrats and Republicans, and I manually coded a sample of those. For Democrats, in our sample, we find that over 75% of tweets are pro-action acceptance. Climate change is real and human-caused, and here's what we should do. The second and third biggest categories were acceptance of climate without explicit calls to action or discussing adaptation approaches. Republicans, on the other hand, nearly half of climate tweets were anti-Green New Deal positions, or more frequently, using the Green New Deal as a means to attack their opponent, attack the presidential candidate, etc. The second largest category was denial or dismissal of climate as an issue, with only about 10% of tweets accepting climate change as real and human-caused. So now I'd like to provide a quick preview of some of the results from these 3 research areas. First, in terms of salience, one simple metric is we find that more than any other issue we examined, any party-owned issue, down-ballot Democrats avoided directly mentioning climate change. Healthcare and jobs were mentioned by nearly every Democrat. Those are perennial favorites. COVID by nearly every Democrat. only about 2/3 of Democrats directly mentioned climate. Drilling a little bit deeper into this, we find that almost all Dems mentioned the environment, but even those that did mention the environment, 1 in 5, made the decision not to mention climate change. And so this brings us to ask, why is that? What predicts whether and how much a candidate mentions climate change? Is it that in more competitive districts, closer races, they are concerned that climate will be a political loser? And so to evaluate this, I applied a hurdle model, and I looked at a variety of variables, political, environmental, and demographic variables. What we found is that the significant variables were, first, chamber. Was the candidate running for US House, state Senate, state legislature? The demographic variables of age and gender, and geography had some effect as well. Competitiveness did not achieve statistical significance, but actually the trend that appears to be there is towards candidates being more likely to mention climate in closer races, suggesting they might be using that to differentiate themselves, although we don't want to overinterpret it. Surprisingly, we found no effect in the environmental variables, which were the air quality and the fraction of clean energy jobs in the district. And the parsimonious models were weakly to moderately predictive, so we have some insight, but there's a lot going on that we can't explain yet, which may ultimately end up being personal decisions on the part of the candidate or the result of engagement by groups like Climate Cabinet. Third, we look at framing, and I ask, how did candidates communicate about climate change? Initially, I applied a fairly simple keyword-based approach because I wanted to look at how climate was connected to other highly salient issues, such as the movement for Black Lives and COVID-19. And I also looked at subtopics expected from the literature, like a renewable energy frame to climate or a natural disasters emphasis frame. However, there are a few disadvantages here. One is that it only gave us moderate coverage of all climate tweets, and the other is that the results you get depend very heavily on the frames that you come in with. And so I also applied a machine learning approach called latent dirichlet allocation in a Python implementation called GenSym. And this has the benefit of inferring frames across all of our climate tweets. Here you can see the results of one run of the LDA. On the left, you can see 26 bubbles representing 26 different frames shown in a two-dimensional topic space with the most 30 salient terms on the right here. As an example, I want us to look at frame number 3. And from the keywords in frame 3, we infer that this is a clean energy jobs frame for discussing climate change that particularly emphasizes the economy, investment, and in this case, actually, bipartisanship, and actually represents most of the climate tweets about bipartisanship. This covers about 5% of the climate verbiage in our data set. And we can also look, for example, at frames 10 and 7, which are in the lower left-hand corner, very close to topic 3. And if we were to look at those, we would find that these are other approaches to discussing clean energy jobs or renewable energy jobs, but using slightly different framing. What remains from here on out with this part of the analysis is for me to fine-tune the LDA to name all of the frames appropriately. And then we can actually look at, okay, now that we have these frames, which candidates were most likely to apply which frames? So I developed my capstone project with the goal of advancing climate change as a political issue in the 2020 election and developing both insights and assets that can be applied in future election cycles. I started by providing electoral support as Climate Cabinet's head of impact, and then conducted academic research into candidate climate messaging. Together, these allowed me to apply skills in programming, statistics, monitoring and evaluation, and to dive deep into both the electoral and climate change communication literatures. My next steps are to complete the manuscript, aiming for that by the end of the summer. I'll be engaged in a professional campaign data training through ARENA, which is the premier organization that conducts these kinds of trainings. And that will give me a better understanding of how data is actually used on campaigns and how it can be leveraged to increase the salience of climate and make climate messaging more effective. And I also have several climate action data projects in the pipeline. In terms of turning this work into impact, I want to continue finding ways to leverage data to provide insights that increase the salience of climate as an electoral issue, operating from the theory that when more candidates run and win on climate change, more politicians will legislate on climate change. And so with that, I want to say thank you to Climate Cabinet, my practitioner partner, to the CSP program and its donors, with a special thanks to my advisor, Dr. Ann Kapuscinski, and Caroline Spears, the Executive Director of Climate Cabinet. Without you, this project would not have been possible. So thank you again. And with that, I will take any questions.